Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly, and today I am joined with a very special guest. I have Daniel Ogden, who is a professor and an author who has just written a book about werewolves in the ancient world. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Of course, very excited to have you. We love talking all about books and anything to do with the ancient world. And you have your new book coming out, which is Werewolves in the Ancient World. Do
Sure.
you want to
Yeah.
just tell us a little bit about the new book?
Well, it may surprise your viewers that it's actually the first book devoted to the subject of werewolves in the ancient world. Um,
Really?
yes, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's an infinite number of books on werewolves. Um, Many of them are kind of well, dodgy books.
Yeah.
And as I said, there's nothing's focused on the ancient world. I mean, often general books on werewolves will start with a very quick reference to the ancient world, but there's been no systematic treatment of all the ancient evidence. So I would claim that the books are first in that way. So I mean, and what does the book um, principally do? Well, it obviously it attempts to understand the ancient evidence in itself and to make sense of the way werewolfism was thought about in the ancient world. Um, but probably the most important contribution is to try to relate the ancient evidence to um, the more recent evidence, and by the more recent evidence, I actually mean the medieval evidence. I mean, in the 12th century AD, there's a sudden upsurge in werewolf stuff,
Really?
particularly in
Cool.
yeah, in Anglo-French literature, in French literature, in Norse literature.
Mm.
And from then on, there's a continuous tradition. Things change in quite a big way in the early modern period, but nonetheless, there's a continuous tradition. So the werewolves that we enjoy today, um, you know, there's a fully direct link back to the werewolves that we enjoyed back in the 12th century AD. Now, the ancient evidence spans well, it depends. One could debate about when it starts, but one could even find it in Homer, so in the 7th century BC, and it peters out with Augustine, more or less, in about 400 AD.
Okay.
So the interesting thing is what's going on in that gap between 800, between 400 AD and the 12th century. So there's sort of
Right.
like 700 years, 800 years. What's going on when we have almost complete radio silence on werewolves in that period? Um, well, there are two obvious hypotheses, really. One hypothesis is that people in the 12th century um, uh, were reading their ancient texts and suddenly were interested in werewolves again and started it all up, restarted it all. And that's perfect. That's a perfectly reasonable suggestion. The other
Mm.
alternative, the more interesting alternative, is that basically werewolves are deeply embedded in folklore. I'm going to say European folklore. Let's not worry about other parts of the world, but deeply embedded in European folklore, and they always were. And they
Mm.
popped up, as it were, for a few centuries in the ancient world, and then during the Dark Ages they went underground again, as it were, and then popped up more or less as they had been back in the 12th century AD. Um, and my argument is that actually that second hypothesis, the more interesting one, is the right one. Actually, there are sort of, if you read the ancient sources very carefully, there are all sorts of subtle hints about a sort of an underlying folkloric culture, which then become very loudly and clearly represented in the werewolf culture from the 12th century onwards.
Right.
And they're not those subtle hints are not the sort of things that you would expect, as it were, the authors of the 12th century to sort of pick up on and sort of run.
Right.
That's not a ball they'd pick up and run with. Really, but those little hints are, I think, early indications of the folklore that they themselves are going to be reusing all those centuries later.
So we don't necessarily know where the myth has originated from. Did it sort of just turn up?
No, we don't. We don't know where it comes from. Again, and that also is a matter for debate. So, um, what other people would say, many of the other people that work on werewolves, they would say something like this. They would say that the notion of werewolfism um, is a projection of ideas about um, uh, young sort of bands of young warriors. Okay, so
Right.
it's an anthropological idea that many ancient and indeed, more modern societies um, have this culture of um, putting, transitional youths, maturing youths into a certain kind of warrior group. Um, in the ancient world, they would have been sort of typically sort of light-armed warriors who are sent off to the borders of a community to patrol the borders rather than the heavy-armed sort of serious soldiers. Um, and anyway, they would argue that there are many societies that have these sorts of this sort of warrior, sort of young warrior tradition, and that werewolves are a way of thinking about, as it were, young men becoming these sorts of slightly wild, undisciplined warriors of the margins. I don't believe that myself. I mean, I should say, so it's a very interesting case. It's got a lot going for it. Um, but for me, I'm always folklore first. I don't think that the werewolf grew out of, shall I say, a social practice or a cultural practice like that. I think werewolves belong in stories. The home of the
Yeah.
werewolf is the campfire horror story, and always was. Um, and it's a very striking, powerful idea in itself, which is then used, I would say, is then used metaphorically by societies in different ways. And indeed, this notion of the youthful warrior band is one sort of um, thing that the pre-existing notion of the werewolf can be associated with. But there are other things too. It can be associated, for example, with ideas of disease, for example. So
Right.
and we find both of those in the ancient world.
Yeah. I mean, I guess when you're thinking about youths turning into men, there's a lot of other wild animals you could have potentially used that might have
Yes.
been more appropriate than wolves. Like it doesn't necessarily strike me as something you have to use a wolf for. Um, so
Mm.
so your hypothesis makes a lot of sense.
Right. Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, that is a that is a good that is a good question, isn't it? I mean, looking across all the werewolf cultures, why werewolves and not,
Yeah.
as in that wonderful movie, why not wear rabbits? For example. Um, I think I'm very reluctant to talk about sort of universal features of werewolves. Um, I think beyond the notion of a man turning into a wolf and possibly turning back again, I'm reluctant to sort of add any more to it,
Mhm.
to our basic definition of the concept. But one thing that is really quite pervasive in the ancient evidence and in the medieval evidence, and indeed possibly even in quite a lot of the early modern evidence, um, is this notion of into the woods. This phrase "into the woods" recurs so often. So a man turns into a wolf and he runs off into the wolf, sorry, into the woods rather.
Into the woods.
Occasionally, a man runs off into the woods and then becomes a wolf. But there's always this notion. I mean, obviously, the title of that recent Stephen Sondheim musical was very very well chosen. And the sort of to be symbolic of our folkloric history. Um, but the so and I do think that does relate to something fundamental, mainly maybe about the werewolf, and that is that it's that the werewolf embodies this transition between, or opposition between, or combination of, or negotiation of, um, if that's not too scholastic, sorry.
No,
You know,
you're all right.
the civilized human on the one hand, and the wild animal on the other.
Mm,
Now, one can see, if one gets to that point, one can see that maybe there is some sort of sense in choosing a wolf, because um, there are senses in which wolves might be considered the ultimate wild animal. Um, I think another factor is actually that wolves are, I mean, very, very broadly, wolves are just about, can be imagined to be sort of human size, at least the bigger ones can be. You can sort
mm.
of, it's easy to imagine sort of a transition between a human and a wolf in a way that it isn't easy to imagine a transition between a human and a, well, I don't
Rabbit.
know, yes, well, a rabbit indeed, you know.
So it's like they've chosen the animal the closest to themselves, like to people. And I guess the dichotomy between civilized man and wild man goes back so far as well. Like you think of the Epic of Gilgamesh, you've got Gilgamesh and
Oh, yes,
Enkidu, and they
yes,
both
yeah, sure.
balance each other with the civilized and they learn something from each other. So do you
That's a
think
very
that
good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes, yeah, yeah.
so this continuous history, did it alter very much between, so I know we've had that dark period and it's very like was it just the idea of the man turning into the wolf, going to the woods, and then turning back into a man, or was there specific points that changed?
Right. Well, um, the notion of the man who sort of recurringly changes into a wolf, which I think is, many people would consider to be fair, sort of fairly integral to the modern
Yeah,
idea of the wolf.
full
That I think,
moon.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Ah, well, that's another thing. Um, um, that probably does, I think, start, so far as our evidence is concerned, start in the medieval period with the medieval stuff.
Right.
Also, I should say, really get going with the medieval stuff. It's not necessarily typical of the way werewolves were thought about in the ancient world. However, the ancient world has one particularly sort of corking story about a werewolf, and this is told by Petronius. It'd be useful for your viewers if I just summarize this story. I mean, it's
Yeah,
the
by all
one,
means, please.
it's the one good one from the ancient world. Um, okay, so this story is told in um, Petronius's novel, The Satyricon. Um, there's a Penguin Classic devoted to it, which people can access easily, and it's a sort of regular sized book. But you have to know that in fact it's only about a seventh of the original that survives, even though it's like a full length book for us. The
Wow.
seventh that survived, yes, it was an awful long novel in origin, and so we have more or less amongst the sort of the seventh of it, we have a good big chunk, continuous chunk, which is the story of a dinner party given by a sort of rather grotesque nouveau riche person, super rich nouveau riche person called Trimalchio. He's an ex-slave, a so-called freedman, um, and he's completely uneducated but likes to boast of his education, and so he gets all his myths wrong and things like that. But anyway, at one point in the dinner party, he and one of his fellow freedmen called Nicaros exchange well, I would say, I've used this phrase already, they exchange two campfire horror stories. Um, and they're both really good. They're both really great stories. And Nicaros' story is about a werewolf. So he tells a story supposedly from his past, when he was still a slave himself.
Mhm.
And despite being a slave, he had a girlfriend who had a pub, and um, and he decided to go off to visit her one night. Or else the timing of it is all a bit vague. But seemingly he's setting off during the night, and his master has a soldier friend staying with him, and the soldier decides to come along just for the trip,
Sure.
supposedly. Um, And so there they are walking down the road, and it's one of those roads like the Via Appia still is actually. If you see that archaeological site, it's a road that's lined with tombs. I mean, often cemeteries were strung out along the sides of roads in Roman times.
Right.
Um, and at one point, the soldier stops to have a pee against one of the tombs. Not very respectful.
No, not
Um,
very at all.
and and Nicaros, sort of, whatever, standing with his hands in his pockets, as it were, and whistling no doubt at the same time. Well, he turns back and he sees that the soldier had actually taken all his clothes off and piled them up. And then he pees around the clothes in a circle, and turns himself into a wolf and
Right.
runs off. Okay, so Nicaros goes to the pile of clothes to, either to retrieve them, keep them safe, see what's going on, and finds that they've been turned to stone. So this peeing in a circle was clearly very magical. Okay, and it's
Mm.
clearly designed to protect clothes. Um, anyway, so he's terrified now. He's terrified, and of course he's in a road of tombs anyway. But he imagines himself being attacked by ghosts from all sides as he runs on and finally gets to his girlfriend's house. And I say the pub also is also clearly a farm as well, and
Mhm.
and his girlfriend tells him, well, uh, you should have been here earlier because a wolf got in amongst the sheep and was just butchering them. But one of our slaves um, put a spear through his neck, and so he ran off with this neck wound. Um, anyway, and so uh, the next morning. Um, Nicaros is on his way back home, and as he passes the tombs where the clothes were left, those are gone, and there's blood. And when he finally gets home, he finds his soldier friend lying in bed with a doctor tending to his neck wound. So,
Wow.
it says, and at that point, I realised he was a werewolf. You might have thought, well, maybe you might have realised that when you saw him turn into a wolf, but nonetheless. Uh, Uh, and then he says, and then I refuse to break bread with him ever again. So that's a great story. And it has.
Yeah, that's
Sorry, I
awesome.
should also have said, by the way, that yeah, there's a full moon whilst this is going on. So that notion of the full moon, or at least maybe we said that maybe it says that the moon is brightly shining. Maybe not a full moon, but you know, if you want it to
It's
be a full
still
moon, it's a full moon, and you can
it still references the moon
yeah, yeah, yeah.
as if there was an
So
importance of it.
yeah, sure. So that is a great story, isn't it? And there are a number of important ideas in it. Well, actually, it is quite interesting that the guy says that he only realizes he's a werewolf um, when he finds him in bed with the neck wound, the identifying wound. That is a very common theme again in the later medieval and European stories. The identifying wound, and I think you can see um, the force of it as a motif already in the ancient world, because as I just made clear, that it's illogical, really, in the context of the Petronius story. Of course, he knew that he was a werewolf when he saw him transform, but that is such a clearly already such a fundamental, well-established motif. You
Mm,
recognize a werewolf by an identifying wound, um, that gets stuck into the story anyway. So it's interesting, isn't it, how even though we only have one really good story of this sort, these sort of little inconsistencies and stray details sort of open up sort of receding vistas of folklore behind it.
yeah,
Um, and the other point to comment on there, of course, is the importance of keeping the clothes um, safe. Um,
yeah,
it's not the motif isn't explained any further in the ancient context, but it doesn't need to be actually. It's obvious, isn't it? Why does a werewolf need to keep his clothes safe? Well, we can easily guess that that's because he needs his clothes if he's going to turn back into a human.
absolutely.
So, so the clothes somehow. So this it doesn't quite again. It doesn't quite work, logically, but the clothes are again the civilized outer carapace of the human. um, which somehow he needs to put back on. So there's a notion that there's a werewolf inside, I guess, which is released
Mhm.
when the civilized outer carapace is taken off. Um, and that notion of keeping the clothes safe, um, because you depend on them to turn back into a human, that becomes very much more very much more developed in the medieval stuff.
It's interesting because I
Um,
feel like werewolves in pop culture, like nowadays, that doesn't get explained. Like you see in a movie, someone just like
oh
rips
yeah,
through their clothes and turns into a werewolf. You're like,
yeah,
okay, are they going to come back when you turn back into a man, or do you have to walk home naked? Like, what's going to happen
yes,
here?
sure,
It just
yes,
doesn't get
quite,
explained. Do you have to buy
yeah,
more
yeah,
t-shirts
yeah,
every week?
yeah, sure, yes, yeah, yeah. Um, so there's that awkward identification, isn't there, between the clothes on the one hand and the human skin on the other. They're sort of the same, but they're not the same.
Mm.
It's again there's a sort of an awkward sort of logical glide there. Um, and I think another thing that's worth saying about that story is, and actually this is the reason I did begin to tell it, um, is that although we only see him transform into a wolf once, it is clearly assumed by the story that this is something that recurs. Again, why? And again, that final line. I refused ever to share bread with him again. Clearly, because he fears it might happen again, and he might get eaten by the
Mm.
wolf. So there is the notion there that the werewolfism is what you might call cyclical. It's not just like a one-off transformation or anything. And that idea is very important, I think, to modern ideas of the werewolf, isn't it? And so there you go. So it all starts there.
Because the fact that he's like peed around his clothes, he's obviously aware of what he has to do. So you can
Oh,
only
sure,
assume that
yeah,
he's done it before.
yes, and of course it. I
Wow.
mean, it also implies that a werewolf has some sort of magical powers as well. We can't all just pee around our clothes and turn them to stone. So
Were they seen as negative, or were they revered in cultures? Was it a positive thing to have
right,
a werewolf
um,
around?
yes, well, as just as you were saying, there's so many interpretations. Um, already in the ancient world. I mean, a number of the references just seem to be quite neutral, strangely.
It
Um,
was there. It just
um,
existed. It's
yes, I mean, sometimes we hear of sorcerers or witches turning themselves into wolves,
Mhm,
and probably that's about just about as good or as bad as the sorcerer or the witches. I mean,
mhm.
the witches in the ancient world tended to be bad, so yeah, I
Right.
think we can say those are bad werewolves. Um, um, and the
So they
ghost of the
weren't
wolf
always men.
skin. Sorry.
So obviously they weren't always men.
Oh yes, that's a very good question. Yeah, the one the one batch of evidence relating to women turning themselves into wolves is again does relate to witches, and that's pretty much confined, I think I'm right in saying, to Roman poetry, Latin poetry, mainly elegiac poetry, actually. Some indication possibly of that in Apuleius's novel, but yeah. So there are yes there are that is an important point. There are female werewolves in the ancient world. Um, so and I mentioned the ghost in the wolfskin. Clearly, he's a bad guy. And has to be dealt with by an appropriate hero. But there are also ostensibly good guys too. Um, so again, it's a story. One's got to sort of work hard to reconstruct it really from um, references to it in Pliny and Pausanias. A chap called either Demarcus or Deminatus
Mhm.
um, was turned into a wolf um, in Arcadia. Now,
Okay.
he again, the story is told in such an elusive way; it's difficult to reconstruct it. But what seems to have happened is, and this is my guess anyway. He was attending the sacrifice of Zeus Lycaios, Wolfie
Mhm.
Zeus, on Mount Lycaon, Mount Wolfie, um, and an enemy, a personal enemy, I suppose, slipped some human flesh into his portion of the sacrifice. So obviously, the animal sacrifice is shared out, and people eat it in the usual way. But somehow, some human flesh is slipped in, and he eats this, I guess, unknowingly. Yeah. Um, Again, well, this is what wolves do. I mean, the wolves they eat people supposedly. So it's quite appropriate that actually eating human flesh should be regarded as a way of transforming somebody into a wolf. And this isn't the only evidence for that. But anyway, so having done that, he was turned into a wolf for a period of, I think, something like 9 years. And well, we're not told how he managed to transform back. I don't know if there was a special way, or maybe, as it were, he just sort of contracted a 9-year curse, as it were, by eating the flesh, and so that was it. But after that, he became a very distinguished Olympic victor, supposedly, and so I think there's no indication that he was there's no strong indication that he was a bad guy. Okay, he seems to have been a good guy, and certainly he ended up as a good guy. So you can have the good werewolf, and again, I think he was sort of a victim of deceit, and that's actually a theme with, again, those early medieval werewolves as well. They tend to be victims of deceit in some way. They tend to be the good guy who is cheated in some way.
Right. Okay, that's interesting because I guess when you think about werewolves nowadays, you get both good and bad werewolves in stories. So
Sure.
it's never clear
Yeah.
cut.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
yeah. I was wondering, where does the English word werewolf come from?
The Well, it used to be said, and actually, this is a notion that I used to have. I don't know where I got it from. That um, well, given that we know what a werewolf is, people are all obviously going to take the word werewolf and say, well, I know that the second bit means wolf, so were must mean man. It must mean man wolf, mustn't it? And actually, the first person to give us an etymology of the word is Gervase of Tilbury, again back in the 12th century AD, very, very important century. And he does in fact say that's how the word works. And he says that the were element is derived from the Latin wir, man, as in
Okay.
virile, wir. So it does mean werewolf. But now, more originally, etymologists and sort of werewolf scholars have really begun to dispute that. And most typically, they say that it derives from a Germanic word. The first element derives from a Germanic word like wearg. Again, it appears in various different forms, which means literally strangler or criminal of some sort.
Right.
Well, again, if you look at the early uses of this word in English and in Scandinavian contexts, um, the notion of wolfiness is already often attached to that word.
Right.
And indeed, actually, it gives the modern Swedish word varg, which actually is the standard word for wolf in Swedish.
Right.
So it seems to me that we just need to think about the history of that word in a different way. And I think we have to sort of lay aside this. I think the innovative meaning is the strangler meaning, and probably in origin, that word did always mean wolf or something like a wolf. Um, so in so in, if that's the case, then werewolf literally means not man wolf, but
Wolf, wolf.
wolf wolf. Now you might think, well, that's not logical, is it? Why should it mean wolf wolf? Well, I just think we have to imagine the context where, whatever you've just seen your man turn into a wolf, and you're saying, "Look, it's a wolf! It's a wolf! It's a wolf! It's a wolf!" You know, I think that's the point of it. Yeah, it's a wolf. It's really a wolf. He's really a wolf.
It is.
Yeah. So
Wow.
that's
Very
my
cool.
suggestion for the original thing, the English word. Yeah.
Was there a word for it in Greek? The Greek
That's a
word
that
for
is
it?
a, that, yeah, that's a great question too. Um, I'm going to say no, at least not originally. Now, again, your viewers will probably be familiar with the word lycanthropy,
Mhm.
and they'll think of that as being a fancy word for werewolfism, which is, when that's what it is indeed these days. And it's made up, well, it's just the other way around, but it's just like, as it were, the traditional understanding of werewolf, in that the like part, the look in Greek, means wolf, and anthrope means man. Again, you know, anthropology, etc. You know. So, but the thing about that word is, although it is a genuine ancient Greek word, at least from the AD period onwards, um, it only seems to be applied to what you might call the medical reflex of werewolfism. That is to say,
Right.
it's used to define a disease um, where I talked about werewolfism being used in all sorts of metaphorical contexts, and this is one of them. So again, the ancients developed this notion. It's clearly what we would call some sort of, we would regard it as some sort of mental illness or some kind of severe depression or something these days. But anyway, the victims who contract werewolfism, lycanthropia, um, become listless, and they're said to roll around amongst tombs and things like that, just hang out amongst the tombs. That association, you see, between werewolves and the dead, and werewolves and the tombs, and so there also there is that. Although there is that term, it's really specifically for, as it were, the metaphorical werewolf condition of this
Sure.
disease. And it does eventually, but you know, we're well into the Byzantine period before the word seems to be applied to sort of what you might call proper werewolves. Um,
Right.
yeah, and in Latin, and Latin doesn't have a word either. It could be, well,
Right.
there is a word, and I mean, if you recall the Petronius story, the punchline of that story is, I realized he was a werewolf and I refused to eat with him again. But the word actually used is versipellis, which actually means skin changer, or
Okay.
I
Like
suppose
a
you could say
shape.
shapeshifter. Yeah, something like that. So arguably the word has a broader use. Um,
Mhm.
um, although, well, that's one. Well, one argument is that it has a broader use. Another argument is that despite its literal meaning, it was used in a specialized way to mean specifically werewolves. And yeah, maybe it was.
Maybe it was.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I will actually have another book coming out in the summer. I'm not sure exactly when, probably about midsummer, you know, June, July, something like that.
Mhm.
Um, and I've written two books on dragons already. This is another one. It's called The
That's
Dragon in
so
the
cool.
West. And again, it's taking the story of the dragon from the just the same way, really, from the ancient world into the medieval world.
Thank you so much for joining me today and for talking with me and Ancient History Encyclopedia. We're going to link below where you can purchase your new book all about werewolves. It's already out in Britain and it comes out on the 7th of March for Australia and US. And there's a new book coming out in the middle of the year as well, all about dragons. So keep your eye out for that as well. Thank you so much for coming along and chatting to us today.
Thank you.
This video was brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For more great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. World History Encyclopedia is a not-for-profit organisation. If you'd like to support our work, hit the support link up in the corner of the screen or via the support link down below. Thank you so much for watching and we'll see you soon.